Well, welcome everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to this year's Department of Defense Grant Seeking Workshop that's hosted by the Interdisciplinary Health Sciences Institute. I'm Stephen Bopart, the Interim Director of IHSI, and again, it's really just a pleasure to have you all here. IHSI's first DoD workshop was held 2 years ago in early 2021, and since then our research development team at IHSI wanted to host this workshop again because since then there's been so many proactive areas in developing a greater awareness of DoD health research opportunities and a better understanding of how to work with these agencies under this DoD umbrella. So the team at IHSI is really prepared to work with you and to share what we've learned and to really engage as much as possible with the DoD. This is an important area of research with many opportunities to use our campus strengths in health science and technology and innovation. And in fact, there's many DoD funding agencies. We've collectively think of the DoD as also including the Navy, the Office of Naval Research, the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, the Army Research Office, and of course DARPA too. And previously we had a DARPA or ARPA-H workshop as well, but DARPA too is part of the DoD. And over the next 3 weeks, this is a multi-day series, and over the next 3 weeks, what we want to present to you is an overview of the DoD and how to find and apply for funding from IHSI's research development team to really look at firsthand knowledge of the DoD from a panel of researchers and reviewers, including consumer advocates, and members of the panel will share some of their own experiences with the applications and review process. We're going to have a guest speaker from the Chez Veterans Center who will talk about resources at the center and how to interact with military and veteran populations. And then finally, we're really excited to have the director of the CDMRP, that's the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Programs Office, Colonel Sarah Goldman. She's going to be joining us and give a keynote presentation during the third week of this series on November 14th. So just wanted to let you know that IHSI is really here to help identify teams and opportunities to help you prepare and pursue these types of grants. Attending these workshops, hearing from experts, asking questions is just a great start. So again, thank you for taking this first step and joining with us today. I also want to just have a shout out to a lot of the IHSI team members here who helped put this together. Maggie, Brandy, Kelsey, Jill, just many others, but really know that the team is here to help you kind of further your ideas in these collaborations. So with that, I will hand it back over to our IHSI Research Development Manager, Maggie Berg, who will facilitate today's discussion. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Steve. So our first speaker today is Kelsey Hassevort. Dr. Hassevort earned her PhD in neuroscience from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She's currently a research development manager and leader of the Community Academic Partnership Corps at IHSI. And she's going to be giving a broad overview of the Department of Defense. So I'm going to hand it over to Kelsey.
Thank you, Maggie. I think the usual Zoom question, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today, I'll be providing a broad overview of DoD funding that will lay the foundation for the subsequent sessions in this workshop. And before we dive into the first part of today's session, a few logistical notes. You can feel free to drop your questions in the chat throughout the session, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. And I'll also add before we get started that you are welcome to take notes, but we will be providing the slides to you after today's session as well. So in the first part of today's session, I'll be providing a brief overview of mission agencies because the DoD is a mission agency. I'll then give an overview of DoD funding, including the types of funding opportunities that you may be interested in. And this will lay the groundwork for my colleague Brandy Barnes' presentation in the second half of today's session. I'll then conclude by walking through the process of pursuing funds from a mission agency like the DoD. So let's begin. So let's start off by talking about mission agencies. And I'll say something that may sound very obvious, but is a very important point because it informs the way the Department of Defense thinks about research. Mission agencies like the DoD are a different breed from basic research agencies that a lot of health researchers may be familiar with. And these differences really matter when it comes to pursuing funding from mission agencies. So let's take a closer look at the differences. Now, many of you may have experienced seeking funding from basic research agencies like the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health. These basic agencies have broad goals and a relatively stable research agenda. And this agenda is furthermore relatively unaffected by changes in political leadership. Mission research agencies, on the other hand, include agencies like the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, EPA, and the newly formed ARPA-H, which many of you may be familiar with. As the name would suggest, mission research agencies are incredibly focused on a specific mission, and this mission is specific to each agency. It's really important if you're going to apply for funding from a mission agency that you understand that agency's mission. And furthermore, the agendas of these mission agencies can change quickly and are strongly affected by changes in political leadership, which is important to keep in mind. So I would say if you take one thing away from this session, let it be this: proposals to the DoD must speak specifically to the mission of the DoD, its agencies, or its service branches. Since mission agencies have ties to the broader political climate and leadership, let's review some of the health research priorities of the current administration. A priority of the Biden administration continues to be research related to the COVID-19 pandemic. This includes research focused on long COVID therapeutics and future pandemic preparedness. We've also witnessed a shift in priorities under this administration to emphasize research on racial equity, climate change, environmental health, and mental health. We know that President Biden favors framing research around big challenges like the cancer moonshot, and further evidence of this is the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, or ARPA-H, which President Biden created in March of this year to push the limits of biomedical and health research and innovation. A final factor to consider here is that with each new political administration comes new leadership at many of the mission agencies, and that includes the DoD. Under the Biden administration, we have witnessed a prioritization of diversity among the leadership of these agencies, as well as a push for science-oriented leadership. And the DoD, of course, has its own set of health-related research priorities, all centered around the DoD's general research mission, which is to support service members, veterans, and their families to aid and promote national security and defense. I've highlighted a few of the DoD health research priorities here, and these are some of the priorities that our team at IHSI believes are the most relevant to researchers at the University of Illinois. These include infectious disease, traumatic brain injury, mental health, human performance optimization, and health IT. In the resources packet, which will be provided to you after the final session of this three-part workshop, you'll find a full list of DoD medical research priorities. Another difference between an agency like the NIH and the DoD is the budget allocated for health research. Last year, the NIH had a research budget of around $40 billion. In comparison, the Defense Health Research budget for fiscal year 20 was closer to $2 billion, out of a much larger DoD research development, test, and evaluation activities budget of $109 billion. I think it's important to keep in mind that while $2 billion may not seem like much compared to the $40 billion NIH research budget, it is still quite a bit of money, and it's certainly worth seeking DoD funding, particularly if your research is a good fit for the mission of the DoD and its service branches. So now that we understand the general mission of the Department of Defense, let's focus in on the specific entities within the DoD that fund health research. And let's start by thinking about how research funding flows through the DoD. So first, Congress approves the research budget for the DoD. Some of those research dollars are distributed through the service branches, specifically the Army, Navy, and Air Force, each of which have their own research offices, which Brandy will be talking about in more detail shortly. Some research dollars are distributed through defense-wide research development, test, and evaluation appropriations. These appropriations fund agencies like DARPA and the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. Additionally, Congress appropriates funding for health research through the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, or CDMRP, which is administered by the Army Medical Research and Development Command. These highlighted research funders will be the focus of this workshop, and Brandy will be talking about them in more detail later in today's session. I'll also note that this is not all there is. This is a simplified overview to help us orient ourselves for the rest of the workshop. The DoD is incredibly complicated, and IHSI staff are always here to help you navigate that complexity if you're interested in pursuing DoD funding. For some additional context, you may come across particular budget activity codes when browsing DoD funding opportunities. The DoD uses these budget activity codes to categorize the type of work it funds. Health research funded by the DoD falls within activity codes 6.1 to 6.3, shown here, which are collectively referred to by the DoD as the Science and Technology, or S&T budget. The type of research funded at universities will most often fall within activity code 6.1, which refers to basic research. And as I've discussed previously, the DoD is not a large supporter of basic research at academic institutions when you compare it to the National Institutes of Health or the National Science Foundation. However, nearly half of DoD's basic research budget is spent at universities. Another thing you may come across when perusing DoD funding opportunities are references to Joint Program Committees, or JPCs. JPCs are responsible for translating Defense Health Agency guidance into research and development needs, and they inform a lot of the research priorities within the DoD. JPC membership consists of both DoD and non-DoD medical and military technical experts, with representatives from the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of Health and Human Services. These JPCs sometimes have their own program announcements, and many DoD-funded research programs are aligned with at least one of these JPCs. You'll see that there are 6 JPCs shown here, and note that it's not a numbering error. There is no JPC 3 or 4 at this point. So you'll see JPCs 1, 2, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Let's move on now to talking about the types of DoD research funding opportunities that are most relevant to university researchers. The first type of DoD research program to know is the broad agency announcement. Basically, BAAs are a technique for government agencies like the DoD to solicit proposals from outside groups like university researchers. BAAs lay out the priorities of an agency, and they come in 2 flavors. Long-range BAAs outline the research interests and priorities of an agency over a several-year range, while targeted BAAs address more specific priorities and competitions. An important note is that the deadlines for targeted BAAs are often very tight, so you're in the best position to compete for them if you're aware of them before they're released. I'll talk about how to get in on that information a bit later. Moving on to Young Investigator Awards. These awards are given to new tenure track or tenure track equivalent faculty, and you'll notice that we have separate investigator programs between the Office of Naval Research, the Army Research Office, the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, and DARPA. So a bit more information about each of these Young Investigator Award programs. So for DARPA, the objective of the Young Faculty Award is to identify and engage rising stars in junior research positions, emphasizing those without prior DARPA funding. and to expose them to DoD needs and DARPA's program development process. The Young Faculty Program provides funding, mentoring, and industry and DoD contacts to awardees who are early in their careers, so they may develop their research ideas in the context of national security needs. The long-term goal of the Young Faculty Award Program is to develop the next generation of academic scientists, engineers, and mathematicians who will focus a significant portion of their career on DoD and national security issues. The research announcement for this award is typically posted to grants.gov between August and September of each year. Similarly, the Young Investigator programs that are administered by the service branches are also designed to attract outstanding young faculty who show exceptional promise for doing creative research and to encourage their teaching and research careers. Again, because this is a mission agency, each service branch is specifically looking for faculty researchers whose work is aligned with that particular service branch's mission and science and technology research priorities. So if you're interested in these awards, I highly recommend taking a look at the various websites of these service branches to get a sense of where your research might be the best fit. Another type of award are these program officers' individual S&T programs. And again, you'll see the same service branches represented here as well as DARPA. In these service branches and at DARPA, program officers have S&T budgets that they can use to fund various projects. And you can learn more about these awards on the respective websites of each service branch. These are usually funded through long-range BAAs. And their budgets vary considerably depending on the particular officer and the particular service branch. The funding decisions are primarily made by program officers themselves, so certainly worth looking into building that relationship. And they can lead to the potential for long-term funding from that particular service branch or agency. Another research program is called the Multidisciplinary University Research Initiative, or MURI. This is a research program that's jointly administered by the Army Research Office, Office of Naval Research, and Air Force Office of Scientific Research. MURI funds university research teams who work on fundamental research projects for 3 to 5 years. The funding amount is $1.25 to $1.5 million per team per year, and the topic areas and calls for proposals are issued once per year. For reference, the 2022 MURI deadlines fell in May, August, and September. With May, the deadline for submitting white paper inquiries and questions, a mid-May deadline for white papers being due, an August deadline for submitting application inquiries and questions, and then a September 9th deadline for the full application. Typically, the MURI deadlines will be released in February of the funding year, so we can expect a new round of deadlines to be issued in February of 2023. There's also a program called the Defense University Research Instrumentation Program, or DURUP. DURUP funds universities to purchase major equipment, which is intended to support DoD relevant research. Proposals may request between $50,000 and $1.5 million. And in order to submit and be successful in this program, you must have buy-in from the program manager. Again, if you have questions about pursuing these specific opportunities, we at IHSI would be happy to talk to you about the specifics of that process. So we've talked about the research funding mechanisms coming from the service branches and other DoD agencies. Let's turn our attention for a moment to the way the CDMRP funds research. And I think this is a particular component of the DoD that is going to be really interesting to all of you health sciences researchers, because the CDMRP is focused exclusively on funding health sciences research. Within the CDMRP, there's a regular rolling cycle when it comes to their funding opportunity announcements. Around December of each year, the new fiscal year funding areas are typically announced, so we can expect that coming in the next couple of months. This is followed by pre-announcements for specific funding areas, which include an overview of anticipated funding mechanisms. Basically, what type of awards will be given out. This is followed in rolling fashion by the comprehensive program announcements, which will provide detailed descriptions of funding mechanisms, evaluation criteria, submission requirements, and importantly, the funding deadlines. It's important to note that dollars for the CDMRP are not considered part of the DoD's core mission and are therefore not included in the DoD's requested budget. Rather, dollars to fund the CDMRP are added every year during the budget approval cycle by members of the House and Senate in response to requests by consumer advocates and disease survivors. Brandy and Maggie will be talking a bit more about the CDMRP later today, and Maggie will be talking about the application process a bit more next week. Let's now turn to a very broad and general overview of the grant seeking process for the DoD. So to simplify this process, let's break it down step by step. You'll want to start by identifying and getting to know your target agency. Once you've identified your target agency, you'll next want to investigate the proposal process at that agency. You may also want to identify opportunities to connect with administrators at your target agency through conferences or workshops. Through these networking opportunities, or through a direct reach out, you'll connect with program officers and intramural researchers to whom you'll pitch your ideas. If your proposed research is indeed a good fit for the agency, you may submit a white paper or a pre-application. And if that is accepted, you'll be asked to submit a full proposal. Maggie will be speaking more about the white papers and details of the proposal process at next week's session. But as we know, grant seeking is rarely a linear process. So really the straight line arrow may look a bit more like this, where you're connecting with POs or intramural researchers, pitching ideas. Maybe it's not the right fit. Maybe you take another look, identify a different agency where your research may be a better fit, and round we go. So let's break these steps down. To familiarize yourself with the DoD, along with its many sub-agencies, you'll need to understand who they are and what they wish to fund. And thus, you should identify their current priorities. And you can do this by looking at their long-range BAAs, which are going to lay out the long-term priorities of each funding agency. Learn the language. As you may have already been able to deduce from today's session, the DoD loves acronyms, and each agency tends to come with its own set of acronyms and its own terminology. You'll also want to find out how the agency of interest announces funding opportunities and subscribe to receive announcements. And you can do this through grants.gov, where you can sign up to receive a daily or weekly digest. And you can also get more information specifically about the CDMRP through their webinar series. Once you've become familiar with the goals and focus of the funder to which you're applying, you'll want to gain a solid understanding of how the proposal process works at your chosen agency, including, do they fund unsolicited proposals, or do they only fund proposals that are responding to a specific FOA? What steps are required to apply? Do you need to first submit a white paper or a concept paper or a pre-proposal, or is that just recommended instead of required? And what are the proposal structure and format requirements? This will vary quite a bit depending on the kind of award that you're pursuing. And finally, what are the review criteria? And importantly, who are the reviewers? Now, once you're familiar with the agency mission and submission process, it's time to start making connections. Program officers and various DoD funding agencies are given large amounts of discretion in making funding decisions, and having a relationship with a program officer can be extremely important to potential applicants. Establishing a relationship with a program officer is not difficult. They're often receptive to phone calls and emails and are usually happy to discuss a potential applicant's research and whether it fits into their agency's needs. I'll also note that program officer accessibility varies by DoD agency, so it won't always be possible to connect with a PO. It kind of depends on where you're seeking funding. But a great place to make face-to-face connections with program officers is at military-related conferences like the Military Health Research Symposium, held annually in August, or the DTRA Chemical and Biological Science and Technology Conference, which is usually held in November, although this can vary from year to year. There are also technology consortia, like the Medical Technology Enterprise Consortia, or MTech, which brings together stakeholders from academia, industry, and the nonprofit sector to accelerate the development of medical solutions that prevent and treat injuries and restore America's military and veterans to full health. Agencies like DARPA also hold what are called proposer days, which are specifically designed to bring together program officers and researchers who are seeking funding from DARPA. So since DoD program officers play a significant role in the funding process, they'll be a determining factor in deciding if your research fits the priorities of the particular sub-agency, and if so, will move your project forward. In order to assess interest in your project, the PO should be your first contact. And thus, you should find out what programs the PO is responsible for and do your homework. Ask yourself why a program officer should be excited by your proposed work. You'll also want to speak to your PO, but avoid a cold call. First, send a short email summarizing your research and summarizing your comments and questions about the funding agency. You'll also want to be able to articulate how your research will help the agency in its programs, and you'll specifically want to concentrate on the big picture, especially the outcomes and deliverables. Again, mission agencies. Be as specific as possible, be persistent, and if your research doesn't fit, don't take it personally and move on. Remember, it's all about the mission of the agency. You may also find it beneficial to form connections and potentially collaborations with intramural researchers. For a bit of context, there are some entities like national laboratories that only fund intramural research. There are other entities like NASA and DARPA that only fund extramural research, so they don't have any intramural researchers to get to know. And then there are funders like the DoD more generally, and NIH, which fund a blend of intramural and extramural research. So specifically, if we go back to our DoD org chart, where you're going to find intramural researchers are within the research offices and labs of the service branches, i.e. the Army, Navy, and Air Force. CDMRP, DARPA, and DTRA do not have intramural researchers. Getting to know intramural researchers in your field can be an important step in working with the DoD and its sub-agencies. This is significant because you'll have colleagues and allies who are interested in your research and who may be the ones who will review your proposal and decide its fate, depending on the agency. So it's important to understand, what do intramural researchers see as important issues? Can you collaborate with them? Do they host academic researchers in their labs? Or do they host students for internships? All of these are great ways to strike up relationships and develop collaborations that may prove beneficial. So let's take a look at one example of this. If we look at the Office of Naval Research, we can see that they offer a variety of opportunities, including a sabbatical leave program that provides an opportunity for faculty to engage in scholarly, creative, professional, research, or other activities that will enhance the faculty members' further contributions to their institution. They also offer a summer faculty research program, which allows faculty to broaden the scope and horizon of their research interests and provides a foundation for future research collaborations. And they offer a number of opportunities for students, both undergraduate and graduate, through the Naval Research Enterprise Intern Program and the Science, Mathematics, and Research for Transformation, or SMART program. You can learn more about these on the Office of Naval Research website, and we'll also provide links in your resources packet. So as I mentioned previously, a great deal of university research is funded by the DoD through unsolicited proposals in response to long-range broad agency announcements. In order to respond effectively to a long-range BAA, you must have a deep understanding of the needs and interests of the agency or service branch that you're applying to. In other words, your research must be mission-oriented. And as I just mentioned, it can be beneficial to connect with the program officer or intramural scientists where possible to ensure that your proposed work is aligned with the organization's mission. You may also consider partnering with a defense company or a federally funded research and development center or FFRDC, if that's relevant to your research. FFRDCs include national laboratories like Argonne National Laboratory near Chicago, the CMS Alliance to Modernize Healthcare based in Baltimore, and Frederick National Laboratory for Cancer Research. You'll be able to find more information about FFRDCs in your resources packet. If you do connect with a program officer, you'll want to be prepared to pitch them your ideas. During this process, you may be asked to produce a white paper or quad chart, which my colleague Maggie will talk about in depth next week. One useful framework to keep in mind as you plan out and put together your proposal is a set of questions known as the Hale-Meyer Catechism. I think this set of questions really captures the priorities of the DoD when it comes to funding research. This set of questions was originally crafted by George H. Hale-Meyer, a former DARPA director, to help agency officials think through and evaluate proposed research programs. The questions include, what are you trying to do? You should be able to articulate your objectives with absolutely no scientific jargon. How is it done today, and what are the limits of current practice? What's new in your approach, and why do you think it will be successful? Importantly, who cares? How much will it cost? How long will it take? And what are the midterm and final exams to check for success? So now that we've oriented ourselves a bit to the basics of the DoD grant-seeking process, you're ready to take a deeper dive into the specifics of getting to know the funding entities within the DoD, which Brandy will be talking about now. Before we move on to Brandy's session, are there any questions?
Yeah, feel free to put your questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself to ask a question directly. I guess I'll just ask one as we're waiting in case anyone needs some time to think about it. So Kelsey, do you have any strategies or advice for navigating the DoD agencies outside of CDMRP for finding funding for health? I know it's a really complicated set of agencies to go through.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think my first piece of advice would be to start on the main web page for each agency. So for example, take a look at the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, the Army Research Office, the Office of Naval Research. Look on their main web page, and there's usually a button that lists out their specific priorities. That's a great way to first determine whether your research is even aligned with those priorities and whether it makes sense to even look at their funding opportunities. The next thing I would say is that on those websites, there's usually a button that says collaborate with us or partner with us. And that is usually where you can find links to their broad agency announcements. And furthermore, all these agencies are posting their BAAs through grants.gov or through sam.gov. And so I would highly recommend signing up for those listservs so that you can get a digest sent to you. And of course, you can always come to us if you have specific questions as well. We're happy to chat with researchers who are struggling to navigate the DoD funding landscape because it is a very complicated one.
Of course. We do have a question in the chat. Are Young Scientist Awards for faculty only?
They are, I would take a look at the specific links for each program because there is some variability between them. For the most part, they are restricted to tenure track or tenure track equivalent faculty, although not all agencies have the same eligibility requirements. So I think I would say take a look at the respective websites for each of those. And the one requirement that does seem to be consistent across all of the young investigator programs is that you need to be a US citizen or US national. There are certain residency status requirements at the time that you apply. So those are a little bit more restrictive. And I do think it's important to note that you do not need to be a US citizen to be eligible for other DoD funding opportunities. It's these young investigator programs specifically that seem to have this residency requirement.
And we did have a follow-up in here. What is tenure track equivalent?
Great question. I can't say off the top of my head, but they do define it. I know that I was just looking at the Office of Naval Research site this morning, and they have a list of kind of context for what they consider to be tenure track equivalent. And I can actually later in the session, I'll try to go grab that link and drop it in the chat a bit later.
Awesome. All right, if there are no more questions, I think we'll move on to our next speaker. So thank you, Kelsey. Our next speaker is Brandy Barnes. Dr. Barnes earned her master's degree in community health and PhD in health psychology from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She's currently a research development manager and leader of the Health Equity Core at IHSI. And she's going to be giving us an overview of health research within the DoD and where to look for those funding opportunities, a little deeper dive into that. So I'll hand it over to Brandy.
Thank you, Maggie. And I apologize, you all will not be able to see me today, but just know that I'm here when I am speaking. So I will share my screen now. And okay. Get this. Okay. So again, like Kelsey said, back to hopefully everyone can see my screen appropriately now. So now we're going to be talking about health research at the DoD and what to expect of the different branches. So again, just to kind of show this diagram again, I know Kelsey mentioned earlier that the total NIH appropriation for FY 2022 was about 40 billion. But again, if we look at that in contrast to the Department of Defense, they have an overall kind of total budget of about 110 billion, but just 2 billion of that is focused on health research. So these are the specific branches that we are going to talk about again today. First, we're going to start with some of the DoD medical research priorities. So again, the general mission of the DoD is to basically support their service members, veterans, their families, and aiding in promoting national security and defense. So all of the agencies that we're going to be discussing today are mission oriented. Again, if you take anything away from today's talk, like Kelsey said, you want to really look at the missions of the individual branches and see how you can best help them accomplish it. So these are the current medical research priorities. Again, we have those listed out here. I wanted to point your attention to kind of the two that are highlighted in orange. These are also ones that are a big focus right now, obviously infectious disease for kind of what's been going on the past couple years. But also the current administration is really interested in looking at racial equity and how that affects its service members. So if you have projects that focus on that, that is something to look at currently. So we are going to first start with the U.S. Army Medical Research and Development Command. So from beginning, so basically from illness to injury, the USAMRDC, they're the only organization that's solely focused on research and development to address the needs of the military. And I think it's really important to note that these needs start early on. So they're looking at the research cycle basically from when someone is recruited to the military throughout their time across their entire lifespan. So that might look at, that might be like 30 to 40 years. So here their goal is to basically manage a large extramural research program with numerous contracts, grants, and the goals of all keeping the soldiers safe and looking at different science and technology capabilities and how we can continue to keep the military of being the leader in this area. They also focus on 5 specific research areas of focus. The First is infectious disease, which obviously has a strong emphasis currently. Combat casualty care. So this is, again, the things around helmets, safety, what it looks like when the military personnel are on the battlefield. They also look at military operational medicine. So this is what's required to keep the military fit in order to deploy. They look at next chemical and biological defense. There's always a risk and a threat of chemical and biological attacks. So they're always interested in research that addresses that. And then lastly, clinical and rehabilitative medicine. So all aspects of clinical care and what that looks like. So they also are the ones that administer the CDMRP. So this is the one that we're going to touch on next. We're not going to spend too much time on it because, again, as you heard earlier, Colonel Goldman is going to focus on CDMRP in her talk kind of on the last week. But some of the hallmarks of the CDMRP is that all of the research funds, again, are specifically targeted by Congress. They're added to the DoD budget on a yearly basis. And they're really looking to fund research that's high impact, high risk. They want to have kind of high gains here, maybe that other agencies might not venture to fund. You'll also note that it was founded in 1992, originally to support just kind of breast cancer research. And also they allow for open competitions as well as peer review throughout the funding decision. So the current goals of the CDMRP are to invest in groundbreaking research. They're also looking at targeting the critical research gaps that exist. And really, they fund the full pipeline of research. So this is from basic translational all the way to clinical research. They're really big on supporting multidisciplinary teams. So they foster collaboration and synergy across multiple departments. And then this last point, which is something that is unique to them, they support the next generation of researchers and established scientists. So they allow for pre-doctoral and postdoctoral candidates to be the PI. And this is something that differs from the NIH research awards. These are the current FY 2022 topics that are of importance to the CDMRP. This is actually just kind of a small snapshot of the diverse range of topics. These are the ones that we thought would be kind of the most appropriate or relevant to Illinois researchers that focus on health. You'll see they have the first category, peer review medical. So again, that's kind of just basic medical research falls under there. Their website has a very robust list that is more expansive than these. They also have what has been funded over the past several years. So I would suggest if you have time, definitely going through their research and kind of going through some of these topics. Again, you'll see that breast cancer, prostate cancer, ovarian, and pancreatic cancer are of importance. So that is something kind of for the, we could partner with the Cancer Center on that as well. And also it's important to note for breast cancer, the CDMRP is the second largest funder for research in breast cancer, prostate cancer, only second to the National Cancer Institute. So they do funnel a lot of money to their cancer research. And again, that peer review medical is kind of a general pool of money that is not really topics specific. I lost my cursor. There we go. Okay, so this is the CDMRP funding process outlined. We're not going to spend too much time going over this because Maggie is going to talk about peer review and programmatic review next week. But the main thing that I wanted to point out with this slide is that consumer advocates are involved throughout the program cycle. So that is also something that is kind of unique to CDMRP, and that's part of their mission and one of the goals that they employ. So you'll learn kind of more about this next week. But also here are some websites. This is the link to the CDMRP. I think I saw Maggie also place that in chat. Thank you. And as Kelsey was saying earlier, grants.gov is a place where you're going to be able to locate all of these funding opportunities across all of the different branches. So next, we're going to talk about the Air Force, Navy, and the Army. We've kind of branched or lumped these together because they have similar missions, and the goal is basically similar across the different branches, with the only difference is whether or not that they are, focusing on the Air Force, the Navy, or the Army. But you can see kind of the main goals there are to manage the manage research and support the goals and operations of their respective services. So the first one that we're going to start with is the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, or AFOSR. They accomplish their mission by investing in basic research efforts for the Air Force in all of the relevant scientific areas. So they look to expand the horizon of scientific knowledge through the management of the kind of their Air Force's basic research program. So you can see here that they solicit proposals through research through the BAAs, or the broad agency announcements that Kelsey mentioned, educational programs, special programs, as well as the University Research Initiative Program. Again, that is a really good program that I just wanted to highlight again, because here you can reach out to them and request funds, again, $50,000 up to $1.5 million, up to a year. And this is just for to get, kind of new equipment or anything that you need that will help with new research or existing research, as long as it's in line with the technical interests of the DoD. So when we further kind of drill down and look at the AFOSR, it's important that you kind of first engage the program managers with a white paper before applying for funding through the BFAs. It's kind of a vital component of their mission. They're divided into these 4 scientific divisions. The main one that we're going to talk about today is chemistry and biological sciences. So this is the one that's most closely related to and focused on health. Within that chemistry and biological sciences, they have the division kind of further divided into 2 areas. So the first is biophysics. So this is looking at basically anything that kind of goes with the autonomy, human performance, kind of enhancing computational development there in terms of what the Air Force needs. And then also human performance and biosystems. So this is just basically looking at the behavioral, genetic, cellular, tissue, and all the systems that make up human performance and how to perfect those in terms of warfare. And again, before you start with them, you should reach out to the program manager and engage them with a white paper before proceeding. Now we're going to talk and move on to the Office of Naval Research. So here their goal is to, again, make the kind of broad investments in the impact in basic and applied research for improvement of their future naval capabilities and systems. For them, their project managers are the technical point of contact for all ONR sponsored research. When we're looking at the Naval Research Framework, the goal here is for them to be kind of the first to field in decisive capabilities. So the way that they do that is they look to align research to their framework's priorities. They allocate different investment portfolios with the goal of accelerating the decision-making and to decision-making of the business decisions and business execution. So they look at that through kind of one directorate, which has changed since kind of the past administration. They are calling this warfighter performance. These are the three kind of sub areas that fall under that category. So if you're looking to do research with ONR, you would want to look at these specific categories and again, see how their mission, how it aligns with your current research. So under human and bioengineered systems, they're looking at cognitive sciences, human factors, organizational design, decision research, and then also social, cultural, and behavioral modeling and what that looks like. Next is warfighter protections and applications. So here they're looking at auditory performance and basic physiological sciences and how to improve those. And then their third category is research protections. So this is looking at improvements in terms of personal protective equipment. So the body armor for the Navy, hearing protection, improvement around their helmets, and then also just overall tools to maximize the human performance and endurance when they're on the battlefield. So something new that they have added this year is that the Chief of Naval Research has these current priorities for 2022 that they're trying to reach. The first one they call the small, the agile, and the mini. So the goal is to develop groundbreaking capabilities to solve kind of key problems at an appropriate speed. The second is what they call decision superiority. So here the goal is to utilize digital tools that include analytics, maybe artificial intelligence, to create or identify information and data into actionable decisions faster than basically the enemy would do. They also look at point defense. So here is to develop modern defense capabilities against either the manned or the unmanned Navy assets and the vessels, and then also be able to kind of counteract any attack from an adversary. And then the fourth is naval STEM / HBCUs and MIs. So this also kind of goes along with the overall arching goal of the DoD medical priorities to look at racial equity. So the fourth priority of ONR is to develop a future workforce of the best trained, highly innovative, motivated to work that is reflective of American society. So they want the workforce to look more like the population. So in order to do this, they're partnering with historically Black colleges and universities, as well as minority serving universities to kind of increase the research in the pipeline around STEM and STEM education. Next, we're going to move to the Army Research Office. Oh, I think there might be a question in the chat. For some reason, it's not letting me see it. But Maggie, let me know if there's a question for me in the chat. But so for the Army Research Office, so this is obviously the research branch of the Army. It was founded in 1951. The research that they conduct is currently in over 250 universities across the country, with more than 1,100 individual researchers. And so kind of the goal of these researchers are to create discoveries that will enable crucial future Army technologies and capabilities, again, looking at those kind of high payoff research opportunities. So the objectives of the ARO are to plan and direct the research program of the Army within their labs. They're trying to create and foster kind of the best atmosphere for research, as well as provide the civilian scientific community with a point of contact into Army research, and also encourage and promote scientific training, as well as the way that it relates to the interest of the Army. So there are 3 specific research directorates for the ARO, the Engineering Services, Information Services, and Physical Sciences. The Physical Sciences Division is the one that's most closely related to health. So their focus there is on basic research to kind of understand our physical, chemical, and biological phenomenon. So it's expected to lead like revolutionary change in categories such as sensing, communications. They're looking at protection in terms of like life sciences. They're also looking at wound healing, maybe power and energy storage. So kind of all of these fall under that physical sciences category. So next we're going to move to DARPA. And as we're actually moving down the list, these are the branches that are kind of the least, not really the least, but they have kind of not as strong as a health focus as, CDMRP. So when we talk about DARPA next, their investment strategy basically begins with trying to, again, have a large impact. Taking on high risk in pursuit of a high payoff is also something that DARPA is really interested in, but their goal is all focused around breakthrough technologies for national security. So they attempt to address a wide range of technology opportunities as it relates to national security. The goal is to not really make pivotal changes, but again, they're hoping to have transformational change instead of like small changes at a time. But the way that they do this is they strongly encourage participation by all sources, all capable researchers. So they're looking at industry, they're looking at academia, individuals as well. And they're again also really focused on that collaboration and the goal of creating new kind of opportunities and new novel things around tactical kind of events. So DARPA has 6 different technical offices, as you can see listed here. The first 2 are the ones that, again, we're going to focus on because these are the 2 that are closely related to health that would be of benefit to our health researchers. So they're the Biological Technologies Office and the Defense Sciences Office. So first, looking at the BTO. So what they're looking at is detecting novel threats and protecting the force readiness. They're looking at warfighter readiness, and as well as operational biotechnology. So kind of the goal here is just looking at the different features to kind of help change the readiness, deploying, physiological interventions to maintain those advantages in the field. And then they're focusing on biotechnology in order of ensuring that the mission has success. And then when we look at the DSO, or the Defense Sciences Office, these are kind of the 6 subcategories that they're focused on. And so kind of the goal down here is to look at current themes are kind of focused on frontiers in math. They're also really involved and interested in computation and design, kind of the limits of sensing and sensors and what that can do in the battlefield, as well as complex social systems. So they look to kind of the greater scientific community to help them kind of come up with these these like big grand challenges and ways that they're able to address them. So DARPA also has released kind of their current research priorities for the biomedical community. and they include human machine teaming. Again, I highlighted they're obviously really looking and interested in vaccine delivery as well as infectious diseases, but also synthetic biology and neuroscience are kind of round out the main topics that they're focusing on for 2022. Again, we talked about a little bit of this earlier through Kelsey's talk, but these are the specific funding mechanisms that are associated with DARPA. They have the DARPA BAAs, or again, the broad agency announcements. They also have what they call seedlings. So again, these are usually submitted through the BAAs, but the seedlings, they are small, they're short in duration. They might be 6 to 9 month projects. Kind of the goal of them is to move concepts from disbelief to mere doubt. And the idea here is to lead the next generation of program ideas. They have the program announcements. Kelly touched on the the proposer days where you can go team up and kind of get input on specific FOAs. There's a very quick turnaround there. And then also DARPA funding tends to lead to transition to other funding. So again, they're looking to fund kind of short-term projects, but that might lead to often multi-year, multidisciplinary efforts with larger teams or transitioning to other branches within the DoD. Now, the program managers are also important to point out here. They're the ones that kind of define their programs. They set the milestones. They meet, with their performers in order to kind of track progress. So the goal here is to address those challenges broadly. It's also important to point out that you should not get too attached to your program officers at DARPA, because these are very high turnover positions. So kind of keep that in mind, that throughout like the research cycle, you might even change project officers or project managers a couple times there. But the technical staff here, they are also supported by experts across different domains. So they're experts in security, legal, contracting issues, finances, human resources, and communications as well. So they're the ones that make it kind of possible to get these things done in a relatively kind of short time. And so the last one that we're just going to kind of briefly touch on is the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, or DTRA. This is probably the one that's least aligned with health research, but we wanted to make sure that you were aware of this. So the goal of DTRA is basically just to safeguard the US and its allies from weapons of mass destruction, and that includes those of chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, or high yield explosives, by providing capabilities to reduce, eliminate, and counter that threat and mitigate any potential consequences. So here, the two that have the most connection to health research are the chemical threats. So they're looking at research that's focused on toxic industrial chemicals, how to combat that, traditional chemical warfare agents, and in terms of biological threats, they're looking at emerging diseases used as a threat and how to combat those, as well as just traditional biological threat agents that we've seen before. So their objectives are, again, to kind of foster the high payoff research. They want to advance science as it relates to weapons of mass destruction. They want to kind of facilitate the translation and the transition of that research. And then also they do have an aspect where they want to promote and focus on university research. So most of the grants that come out from DTRA are going to be for up to 5 years, and they're awarded typically to degree granting colleges and universities, but also not-for-profit entities, as long as it's one that predominantly focuses on research. The goal for them is to really kind of, they say, out-science the enemy. So as you can see, these are, let me bring them up. These are kind of the different branches that are focused on, they have their own specific directives and missions that they seek to address. Your mission must be one that is mission oriented. So a great first step would be to review the individual missions of, the different branches, whether it's CDMRP or ONR or DARPA, and see how your research can address their needs. If you have any specific questions, again, we would say kind of start with going through their individual websites, but do not hesitate to reach out to us at IHSI and the RD Corps, and we would be happy to assist and kind of help you navigate through these and maybe even find the appropriate funding opportunities for your research or even appropriate collaborators. So with that, I think I'm going to stop sharing.
Great. Thank you, Brandy.
Thank you.
So yeah, again, feel free to put any questions in the chat for Brandy or Kelsey. I'm going to get to a couple of these. So we had a question about how does ONR define auditory performance, which I actually did put a link in there to more details on that program. But I think this brings up a broader question about, do you have any advice for finding this type of information? Are there like good strategies to follow for getting those kinds of definitions?
Yeah, I would say definitely the best place to start is their website, but a lot of times you're going to have to jump around a lot, because I know when we were looking for this information that some places it wasn't readily available, so they might link us out to someone else, or basically I had to kind of find the different directives in multiple different places. So again, I would say start with their website kind of as a good first step. But if you have any additional questions, definitely kind of reach out to us and we'll see where we can kind of point you to in the right direction.
Is this something that would also be a question for like a program officer or program manager?
Yes. A lot of these, and that is a really great point too. A lot of them say that they are your first point of contact. So, and they're all of their information is going to be listed on the websites. Yes, they do turn over, but it was very easy to find who's over, Warfighter Performance 34 for like ONR. So definitely start with kind of like your program officers and your program managers is that first point of contact.
Thanks. Excuse me. There was also a question about when are the proposer days, or where can you find those dates? And I think they are on the DARPA website somewhere, but I don't know if, Kelsey, I don't know if you came across a good resource for when those dates are actually posted.
So I think it's one of those things where it's helpful to just check regularly, because it doesn't seem like they have a regular posting schedule, and they also have separate proposal days for each of DARPA's program areas. So there's not one unified proposers days, but I'll do a little bit more digging there and see if we can put some resources in that resources packet. I'm also going to drop a link in the chat for those who may specifically be interested in DARPA. They're having a kind of ongoing hybrid conference right now that folks can pay $25 to join virtually. And they still have some upcoming events this fall that I think gives a bit more information about the agency and what their latest priorities are.
Great, thank you. This is another question is for Brandy. So you talked a lot about the agency priorities, and I was kind of wondering how much do those priorities shift from year to year? I know it's been almost 2 years since we've done this workshop before, and so I'm wondering how much of a difference did you see as you're kind of going through them again this year?
Yeah, there was a drastic change, but I think it's also important to note that when we kind of first did this, a lot of the information was still based kind of under the previous administration. So I would say they do change from year to year, but I think we've seen kind of more of a drastic change since it was going from one administration to the next. But it is important to look at those changes just every year. I mean, because they added infectious disease and obviously racial equity for 2022. So if those are areas that you're interested in, obviously submitting proposals focused on those would be of kind of a better chance, I guess. But yes, I would say definitely look from year to year with paying considerable attention across different administration changes.
Great. One more question, unless anyone else has a burning question they want to ask. So this could be for either of you or both. What resources are there on campus for finding partners to respond to opportunities that come out of these agencies, or like for DARPA in particular, since that one tends to have more of a partnership focus, and I believe that's going to be very similar to ARPA-H as well. Do you have any other resources that people could look to get connected with a partner?
Well, I can answer that first. I think I would encourage folks, especially if you're in the health sciences, to come talk to us at IHSI. I think resources like the Chez Veterans Center that you'll learn more about at one of the subsequent sessions in this workshop can also be incredibly helpful. And I would also encourage folks to talk to other researchers, either on this campus or at other universities, who have had DARPA funding or IARPA funding. The ARPAs all kind of use similar mechanisms, even though their priorities are different. And we expect ARPA-H will have programs that function like DARPA programs, that they'll be high risk, high reward, that they'll incentivize partnership. And the mechanisms may look the same. They may have similar proposer days to DARPA. So I think it can be incredibly useful to hear from other researchers who have navigated that process, because it is a very unique process compared to a lot of other funders. So definitely talk to others, talk to research development professionals at places like IHSI or within your unit to help you forge those collaborations.
Yeah, I would just kind of second what Kelsey said. I think that's great.
Awesome. All right. If there are no other questions, I think we're going to wrap up for today. So thank you for joining us, and thank you to both of our speakers. As you're signing off from Zoom, you should see a short survey pop up in your browser. We would really appreciate it if you could take just a couple minutes to fill that out and give us some feedback on today's session. We will have a recording of today, as well as the slides available soon, probably within the next week. And we hope that you'll come back next week when we're going to be covering the grant application and review process. I'll be giving a presentation about that process, and we'll also be joined by a panel of researchers and reviewers for a panel discussion about their experience with DoD, so you can get kind of an insider perspective on how all of that works and how you can craft a really strong proposal. So thanks again, and have a great week.